Later in the day, Admiral Kusaka's 11th Air Fleet sent a much larger A force to sink the carrier, and the 6 transports she protected, more than 60 Zeros, escorted 24 dive bombers to make the attack. But the coast watchers, the radar, and the American fighter pilots were waiting for them. The Japanese fighters did their job magnificently, sacrificing themselves to let the bombers get through, but when the bombers did get through the American fighter screen, they found the anti-aircraft guns on Guadalcanal, and aboard the ships took a heavy toll, and half a dozen bombers got anywhere near the targets with their ordnance. The cargo ship Soleno was hit twice and was so badly damaged that she had to be beached, but at least she did not sink. Landing ship Tank 340 was badly hit, and the soldiers she carried were ordered to swim for shore, but as the attack wound down, 2 other landing ship tanks came up with firefighting equipment, and they managed to save the vessel few of the Japanese fighters, and fewer of the bombers got home that day. One pilot reported exuberantly that they had sunk all 6 of the transports, but the next morning the scout planes reported the true situation off Lunga Point. The big ships were all still there, unhurt. 2 days later, the Japanese tried again. Another dozen bombers came down the slot, escorted by about 30 fighters again. The effort was repulsed by the flyers from Guadalcanal with heavy losses for the Japanese, but Admiral Kusaka did not quit. Before dawn on June 16th, the Japanese scout planes were over Guadalcanal, and they reported seeing 5 large transports and 28 smaller vessels in the open sea between Cape Esperance and the southern tip of the Buells at Rabaul. Japanese intelligence recognized the signs of a forthcoming invasion effort, and at 11th Air Fleet headquarters the orders went out. This would be the day for the big air battle. The weather could not have been better for flying that morning. The sun came up in a cloudless sky, and there was virtually no wind. It was hot already, the middle of the hot season, but no one noticed it. The whole Rabaul base was alive with excitement. For this great battle had been a topic of conversation for weeks after all the casualties the 11th Air Fleet had taken in the past 2 weeks. All the Japanese pilots knew that many would not come back that day, but they were all resigned, even lifted to a sort of exaltation by realization of the nearness of death. They lined up on the runways beside their planes. The ground crews came out and delivered box lunches and soda pop, 3 bottles per man, and they made ready to take off at 10 o'clock. 24 dive bombers from the 582 bombardment group took off, followed by 48 Z fighters from the 204th and 582 fighter groups. They would be climbing to gain altitude all the way to Bua, where they would link up with 25 fighters from the 251st group, making one attack formation of nearly 100 planes. They would fly high above the Solomon Sea to Guadalcanal to destroy the Allied flotilla. Lieutenant Manano was leading the 204th fighters in their watch over the bombers over the sea. As they approached Guadalcanal, he noticed that 2 of his fighters were having trouble because they had throttled back so tightly to maintain speed with the slower bombers. There was nothing below them but water, and it was many miles to the nearest friendly territory. If they went into the sea, then it meant 2 more airmen lost. Manano ordered the bombers to speed up when one plane began to lose power and sink towards the sea. Manano dropped down to head the pilot toward Kolombangara Island, the last possible field for an emergency landing. The mission went on Miyano LED his fighters all the way, and when the ships came in sight, he would give the order to attack at 12:30 a.m. The Japanese force was over the Russell. The warnings went out at Henderson Field, and American fighter pilots began to scramble for their planes. Soon they were in the air, P-38, SP-4, SF-4, FS-F-4Us, and even some vintage P-39S, which could be effective only at a low level. The 339th Fighter Squadron made the first contact with Miyano's Force Lieutenant Murray. J. Schwinn was leading a flight of 4 P-38S northward when he spotted the big Japanese formation 15 miles from the western end of Guadalcanal. Here the altitude capability of the P-38 proved an advantage. The Japanese were coming in at 24,000 feet, but the P-38S were at 27,000 feet prime position for an attack. Lieutenant Schwinn did not wait for reinforcements. He led his flight down in a charge on the last dozen Zeros the Americans came from above and behind the Japanese, and when they reached firing range, they began shooting. That first surge knocked out 5 Zeros before they could react. Then, one by one, the P-38S were also hit or ran out of ammunition and zoomed away from the battle. This action was of the sort that led the Japanese to believe that they were shooting down Allied planes, when they were not actually at the end of 15 minutes. All the P-38S had left the battle except Schwinn. He continued to fight for another 40 minutes, and in a series of furious battles shot down 3 more planes and damaged another. That one P-38 accounted for at least 5 Japanese Zeros. That day it was no wonder that the men of the 11th Air Fleet had such high regard for the P-38 with its 20 mm cannon. By the time Schwinn left the scene, scores of other Allied planes had joined the battle coming up from the 3 Guadalcanal and 2 Russell airstrips. 21 P-4S from Henderson Field got off the ground shortly after the P-38S met the enemy up north. By the time these United States planes were airborne, the Japanese dive bombers had arrived over Guadalcanal and were preparing to attack the ships in longer roads. The P-4S and 2 flights of P-39S began to work over the dive bombers the Zeros peeled off to meet the threat and took most of the punishment so that the bombers would have a chance at their targets. By this time, the fight had moved out over the channel between Lunga roads and Tulagi, as the bombers went after the shipping Lieutenant Manano was leading, watching and directing, and Warrant Officer Sub-Zero was just behind him. Suddenly out of nowhere appeared an F-4F. The pilot put one short burst into Miyano Zero, and it nosed over, burst into flame and crashed into the sea. Warrant Officer Sugg took over leadership of the mission and somehow got the survivors back to Rabaul. A number of planes dropped off at Kolum Bangara Island to make emergency landings. The Allied planes did not pursue, having used much of their fuel in the aerobatics of fighting. The Japanese came home from the raid sad because of Miyano's death, but not dispirited. They claimed to have sunk 6 transports actually they had, hit 3 and done considerable damage to them, and to shore installations the Japanese also admitted to heavy casualties. The Americans claimed to have shot down 66 of the 100 Japanese planes, with a loss of 6 Allied aircraft. But the fact is that the raid was not a failure by the Japanese standards of the day, by American standards. It was damaging, but not as damaging as the Japanese believed it to be. Another factor had entered the Pacific War equation. The American industrial machine was in full gear, and more war material was being sent to the Pacific than before. Therefore, in terms of replacement possibility, the Japanese damage on this and other raids was much less meaningful than it would have been the positions been reversed, and the Japanese belief in the success was not pretense. Lieutenant Manano was mourned throughout the 11th Air Fleet. Further, he received one of the most meaningful of Japanese Navy accolades. Posthumous, he was promoted 2 grades to become Commander Miyano. It was a very real honour in a service where promotions were sparse. He had flown 228 missions and shot down 16 Allied planes, and he had been shot down by a tyro in one of those flukes of war. The death of this highly competent and experienced fighter pilot was indicative of the Japanese naval aviation problem that would grow worse each month. The best men were dying as the Allied plane strength increased by great leaps. The Japanese plane production machinery was just about keeping up, but the air training program was not producing pilots fast enough to replace the dead. The big raid of June 16th marked the end of the Japanese 11th Air Fleet effort to halt the American move north. The truth was that temporarily the attack potential of the Rabaul Air Force was nearly exhausted. As of June 20, the fleet had been reduced from the high point reached in the spring to 53 twin-engine Betty bombers, 13 Val dive bombers, and 83 ZOS, Admiral Koga's air offensive. Really, a continuation of Admiral Yamamoto's operation, one had come to an end. It had failed to slow Admiral Hall's progress for the first time since the beginning of the Pacific War. The Allies were on the offensive after the fall of Guadalcanal. Admiral High proceeded in an unhurried fashion to prepare for the attack up the Solomon chain, while General MacArthur did the same. In New Guinea, the Japanese regarded what was happening as a breathing spell. That was a major miscalculation. All the while the Allies seemed to be resting, they were bringing tens of thousands of tons of supplies, and tens of thousands of new and ED troops into the South and Southwest Pacific to carry on the 1943 operations to be sure the Russell were taken with a very mixed invasion force. But that was the last of such operations. The planning for the invasion of New Georgia was thorough and leally, as such things went. The first objectives were to be 4 spots in the New Georgia area to be taken for their tactical value. In the main invasion, one was Wickham Anchorage on the southeast coast of Little Vanunu Island. This would become a fuel station for PT boats and other small craft from the Guadalcanal area. The second objective was CI Point on the south coast of New Georgia, which the CBS were to turn into a fighter strip in short order that would eliminate the need for long flights from Henderson Field or of the need for heavier reinforcement. Even then, they had not got used to the idea that this war in the South Pacific was going to be fought in terms of divisions and not battalions. Early in May, General Imamura sent Major General Minoru Sasaki down to New Georgia with the title of Commanding General Southeast Area Detachment. Sasaki was a highly trained and highly regarded member of the officer corps. He was then 50 years old, and his career had begun in the cavalry. He had studied in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and in Poland he had gone to Army General Staff School, served in the very important Military Affairs Bureau of the War Department, which actually made Army policy, and in 1936 had joined the Army General Staff since his promotion to Major General in 1939. He had served in the field continuously until 1942, when he again went to Tokyo as head of the Mechanized Department of the Army. From this post he came south to take over the defense of New Georgia, and on his insistence the flow of supplies and men increased sharply when the Allies became aware of this new Japanese policy. Admiral Holly ordered bombardment of the Japanese bases at V and Munda. The first attack was carried out on May 12th. The bombardments were successful only in the sense that none of the Allied ships was sunk. They stood offshore first at V and then at Munda, and fired away for several hours using up 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The damage to Japanese installations was minimal. Mine layers came along and laid more mines in Kula Gulf, and like the bombardment, the mine laying was uneventful. But there were some accidents as aboard the cruiser Nashville when a shell exploded inside a gun turret, killing several men and wounding several more, and the mines the force laid were effective no more than 1 day before the Japanese swept them up. The mine laying had hurt the Japanese when it came as a total surprise, but after the initial surprises the Japanese brought more minesweepers down from TRU, and the mine damage ceased. The results of such operations were not productive, as Admiral Nimitz saw immediately. When he reviewed the action reports of the units involved, he ordered Holly to stop the marginal operations and get on with the invasion of the Central Solomons. Holly already had the idea. His operation plan was drawn, and he was nearly ready to go, and the plan had the great virtue of simplicity. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was told to start working up the Solomons chain. He was not told how to do it. In essence, Holly gave the ball to Admiral Turner and told him to run with it. One of Admiral Holly's peculiarities of operation was that he insisted on maintaining tactical control of his forces. Although he remained at Numa, that was not as difficult as it may seem, because radio communications kept the Admiral in constant touch with events, and that was the way he wanted it. Turner was named commander of Task Force 31, which consisted of big transports of the President-class President. Hayes, President Jackson, President Adams, plus a number of landing ship tanks, destroyers, minesweepers, and smaller invasion craft such as tank landing crafts, infantry landing crafts, patrol boats, PT boats. 3 infantry units were part of the force too. A western landing force built around the Army 43rd Infantry Regiment and an eastern landing. Force built around the Army 103 Infantry Regiment, and a reserve of Marine Raiders. The 2nd Marine Air Wing would be responsible for getting planes into New Georgia as soon as possible, and operating out of there, the whole invasion area would be generally protected and policed by Task Force 36, the battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers of the 3rd Fleet, which High kept under his own direct command. Kelly Turner's mission was stated very simply: This force will first, on D-Day, capture Renova Island, the Viro Harbour, SEI Point, and Wickham Anchorage areas, capture or destroy enemy garrisons, and develop these positions for offensive operations second at the first favourable opportunity thereafter, when directed by the Commander 3rd Fleet capture in succession, Munda Column Bangara and other enemy positions in the New Georgia Group, and capture or destroy my garrisons. Third, the purpose of these operations is to prepare for further operations. Up the Solomons, had the Japanese been given an advanced look at Admiral Holly's orders, they would have thought the Americans were crazy. No one except the Russians in Manchuria had ever stood up to the Imperial Army for long. The events of the last months of 1942 had occasioned some changes in the thinking of Japanese officers in the South Pacific, but they had made little impression on the staff officers who manned the Imperial General Headquarters, most of whom had never commanded an army or navy unit in battle, even after the defeats at Ruin and Guadalcanal. General Tojo's government still believed that the war could and would be won. Admiral Kusaka, the overall commander of the South Pacific for the Japanese, and General Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, saw what was coming. On May 22nd, the Navy's aerial scouts had counted 278 planes on Guadalcanal. Over several weeks they had noted and reported on the constant build-up of the bases. General Imamura sent word to Admiral Koga at True that reinforcements and supplies were needed vitally, and he got them. During the month of June, 3 transports began to ply busily between True and the Central Solomons bases, bringing in about 1,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. On June 27th, Imamura dispatched reinforcements to Column Bangara. The bulk of 1 battalion of the Army 13th Infantry Regiment was delivered to the island by the destroyers Mochizuki, Yag and Satsuki that night without incident, and that meant another 800 defenders. But the Americans were aware of the reinforcement, and the next day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the new unit had its baptism of fire when 48 American bombers attacked Munda Airfield. They destroyed a number of installations and 2 anti-aircraft guns. The anti-aircraft gunners claimed to have shot down 5 Allied planes. Then at 7 o'clock on the night of June 29th, Munda Airfield was shelled by 2 United States destroyers. Even so, that same night, the destroyers Nagatsuki and Minazuki delivered more troops and ammunition to Column Bangara. They also delivered the regimental commander Colonel Tomonori, who arrived with regimental flags flying. It was apparent at Munda, and the word was passed to Rabaul that an invasion was imminent, but the old ways died hard. The Japanese referred to what was coming as a Hanko counterattack, and technically speaking that was correct. The Japanese had occupied these islands at the end of 1941, so any attack now was counterattack, but the Army and Navy thinking was still overshadowed by vestiges of the past. It was hard to forget the days when the Imperial forces rolled up one victory after another. The self-deception inherent in the use of the word counterattack was one thing, but military hyperbole was invoked with predictions of crushing blows and annihilation of the enemy, whatever they called the movement that was coming from Guadalcanal. The troubles of the Japanese in the Solomons were just beginning. The first move in the invasion of the Central Solomons occurred on June 20th, and in a sense it was inadvertent. Sea Point at the southeastern end of New Georgia was regarded as enormously important to the Allied plans. For the next few weeks here, the CBS would rush in to build an airfield to take the pressure off Guadalcanal and the Russell. For several weeks before the invasion, small parties had slipped in and out of the area, often by submarine, to make contact with the local coast watchers and familiarize themselves with the terrain. The Japanese were well aware of the activity, but were unable to stop it. Around the middle of June, the activity became so notable that the Japanese garrison commander at Viru sent a large detachment southeast over the mountains to capture and hold SEI Point, then to build an airstrip there. But the resident Allied coast watcher D.G. Kennedy had already proved to be as much a guerrilla fighter as a watcher. He kept a schooner in a little bay, and had been known to fight pitched battles with Japanese patrol craft. He maintained a force of local warriors who had remained loyal to Britain throughout the year and a half of Japanese occupation. They had ambushed small parties of Japanese from time to time, and when Kennedy learned from the island telegraph that the Japanese were coming, he prepared to ambush this party as well he did, so killed a number of the Japanese and scattered the rest, and captured the notebook of Major Hara, the commander of the detachment. The notebook gave all the details of the Japanese plan to hold SEI that night. Kennedy sent a radio message to Guadalcanal with the news strong enemy patrol has approached very close, and by their numbers and movement. It is believed they will attack urgently, suggest force be sent to defend SII Admiral Turner, responded by sending Lieutenant Colonel Michael S. Currin with Companies O and P of the 4th Marine Raider Battalion on the night of June 20th in the destroyer Dent and Waters. The raiders were to hold Sea Point, but the destroyers had some difficulty getting into these restricted waters, and both scraped bottom. Luckily, the bottom was mostly mud, and the most serious damage done was to the Denport propeller, which took a Ming. The raiders were landed just after 6 o'clock on the morning of June 21st. 4 hours later, their defences were declared secure on June 22nd. The destroyers Shelley and Crosby brought 2 companies of the Army 103rd Infantry Regiment and a naval survey party that was to do the preliminary work for the building of the airstrip. The Japanese sent patrols around the island, but they were kept under watch by the Solomon Island soldiers, who reported every move to Coast Watcher Kennedy. The area was regarded as so secure that 4 days later war correspondent Clay Gann of the Chicago Tribune was brought into Say aboard a PBYC plane on the evening of June 27th. The Marines turned Sea Point over to the Army troops and moved off to begin the second part of their advance operation. They were to cross the 5 miles straight in rubber boot and land on New Georgia at SGI, then move overland to Vairu Harbor, where they were to assault the small Japanese garrison. Allied intelligence indicated that the garrison consisted of about 100 men. There were actually 229. The Marines were to take possession to prepare for the official invading force, which was to land on June 30th from the sea. The advanced unit landed in the early minutes of June 28th and bivouacked for the night at 6:30 a.m. The Marines were going again in single file along the narrow jungle trail, heading north across the mountains. 3 hours later, the rear guard encountered a Japanese patrol, and in the firefight that ensued, 4 Japanese were killed, and 1 or 2 escaped into the jungle. The Marines suffered no casualties, but it was apparent that they would not make Vairu Harbor by the morning of June 30th, as they had hoped. They sent a message to Coast Watcher Kennedy back at Sea Point to relay to Admiral ER 45 minutes later. The rear guard of the column was hit by a larger enemy patrol. This one armed with machine guns. The jungle became bedlam when the noise of the firing subsided. Sergeant Sudro and 4 men from Company P were missing. That night the raiders bivouac on the Mohi River. At 6:30 the next morning they moved out again. The sergeant and the 4 men had not shown up again at 11:15 a.m. The Japanese hit the rear guard. Lieutenant Brown's platoon took the worst of it when the fight was over. 5 Marines were dead and 1 man was wounded. They counted 18 Japanese bodies. Lieutenant Colonel Curran decided to deal with the problem. At the source he detached Company P, except for the weapons platoon, to attack the village of Tom, where the Japanese were concentrated. Captain Walker was in command. With him were Lieutenant Peller, Lieutenant Brown, and 100 men at 9 o'clock on the morning of June 30th. The main body crossed the Vairu River, and the next morning it approached the village of Tara, the location of the Japanese garrison for Vairu Harbor. Admiral Mitch's Guadalcanal Air Force cooperated and sent dive bombers to plaster the village that morning. But even so, when the Marines came up, the Japanese were ready to fight, disposed before the village, and out on both flanks the Marines approached, and the struggle began. This time Colonel Curran heard heavy machine gun fire, though the Marines began to take casualties. After an hour they had advanced about 100 yards, and there they were stopped until the colonel moved machine guns forward. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the force managed to get around to the south and take possession of the ridge there with a ravine on the right front. The Japanese sent out flanking forces. Colonel Curran sent demolition squads with satchel charges to both flanks to deal with the heavy machine guns that were beginning to harass the men again. At 3:30 p.m., the Japanese decided to charge the Marine position and began working themselves up to it with screams and yelling, "Marine, you die, Tenno Haika Bansai," but the assault failed, and half an hour later the Marines overran the enemy positions at 4:30 that afternoon. They had sole possession of Tamara village, and at 5 p.m. the tank landing crafts of the invasion force landed. Colonel Kurin brought in his 6 dead and 17 wounded Marines. They did not then count the dead Japanese. They assembled the captured equipment, 6 light 25 caliber Nambo machine guns, 431 caliber machine guns, 6 field guns. Captain Walker and his men arrived from Toomey to report no casualties, and they had killed a dozen Japanese during the night. 2 of the wounded Marines died the next day. A 30-man patrol sent out to mop up killed 2 more Japanese soldiers on the 4th of July. The American had good news. Sergeant Sudro and the 4 Marines missing after the first Japanese ambush had made it back to SEI Point. From then until July 9th, the Marines patrolled the area and killed several more Japanese soldiers at 5:30 a.m. On July 9, they embarked in landing craft for Guadalcanal, turning VU over to the army troops. The Marines had taken 28 casualties, 13 of them killed in turn. They had killed 60 Japanese and wounded another 100. Most of the Japanese garrison escaped into the jungle and began working through the bush toward Munda. At Munda, the rains had begun in earnest on June 23rd. There it was fog and drizzle, but at Renova, where the northern part of the island is largely flat, red clay PL land, the constant rains of the next few days created a quagmire, and everything was flooded for 3 days. At the end of June, the American bombers and fighters seemed to hover almost constantly over New Georgia and Kolum Bangara Islands. The airstrips at Villa and Munda were pitted from constant bombing, and no Japanese planes could get in during the daylight hours. Any trying to get out would have met a wall of gunfire. There was also a good deal of activity on the ground behind the Japanese lines as advanced United States parties moved in and out of the areas that would soon be attacked, in order to make plans for rapid build-up of the bases once the Japanese were driven out. This sort of movement was not as dangerous as it seemed, because the Japanese never controlled the entire islands, but only pockets where they built their bases guided and guarded by the coast watchers and their native troops. The Allied surveyors were relatively safe on the night of June 29th. Admiral Merrill brought his destroyers and cruisers to the shores of New Georgia to shell the Rata Bay base, and lay mines. Japanese headquarters at True and Rabaul knew what was coming before the troops did. On the night of June 29th, the submarine Row 103 was patrolling west of the Russell Islands when her captain sighted a large force of warships and transports moving northwest. They had to be heading for the Central Solomons. Still, the Japanese naval headquarters at Rabaul was caught off guard on this same day. General MacArthur's troops were landing at Nassau Bay, 17 miles from Salawa, on New Guinea. At the same time they were landing in the Trobriand Islands off the New Guinea shore. The Allies were conducting an enormous troop build-up that did not go unnoticed at Rabaul. The problem was that there were too many rat holes to watch, and from the middle of June onward the Japanese were aware of the danger from Guadalcanal. They knew that the Americans were poised for action, but the Japanese had planned their defences and their strategy, which called for concentration on New. Batteries on Munda Cape were knocked out ashore on Renova. The fighting was furious but brief. The Japanese garrison seemed at first to be confused, but a young naval officer, Lieutenant Sender, seized command and led the men in fighting to the last. It was an uneven contest. How uneven is shown by one small event. A boat returned to the Macaulay, carrying 1 wounded soldier. The sum total of United States casualties could be rounded up at 8 o'clock that morning. The fighting was over on Renova. A handful of Japanese escaped into the jungle from the naval and army commands at Rabaul. Came an order to withdraw from Renova. It was picked up at Munda, and a bugler blew 3 blasts to tell the survivors on Renova that their mission was finished. Still, no help had come for the Japanese. At that moment at Rabaul, there were 71 Zeros, 20 dive bombers, 41 torpedo bombers, and 5 scout planes available. And because there were 2 landings in 2 widely separated parts of an extremely broad front facing the Rabaul Command New Guinea and the Central Solomons, Admiral Kusaka's 11th Air Fleet could respond to the American landing only with a fighter sweep at 9 o'clock. Tokyo time that morning, 27 Zeros got off the ground and headed for Renova. The first indication of their arrival came at 11 o'clock when the task force off Reno over went to battle stations in response to a report of bogies coming in. A few minutes later, the Japanese fighters were engaged in an air battle with a larger group of American fighters from Guadalcanal, somewhere between 30 and 40 fighters. The fighting was carried out at high altitude, 21,000 feet above the invasion fleet, and not much was seen from the water or the ground. But the Allies, Americans and New Zealanders had the best of it, claiming 16 Zeros. Several Allied planes were shot down, and one pilot was rescued by a boat from the Macaulay. The destroyer Buchanan picked up 2 more pilots by noon. Admiral Kusaka had his bombers armed and ready to make a major attack on the American invasion force, with 24 fighters and 26 twin-engine Mitsubishi Betty bombers fitted for torpedo world. The Japanese came down the slot to rend over harbour, but found that the invasion fleet had landed its troops and supplies and moved off, heading back toward the relative safety of Guadalcanal. The American fighter cover over Renova began trailing the force and sniping at the tail end Charlie's, and managed to pick off a few, but just after 3:30 in the afternoon, United States Time General Quarters was sounded aboard the Macaulay. The Japanese were closing fast up above 41. American fighters moved to intercept the Japanese, followed their usual tactics. The fighters lured and engaged the American fighters, while the torpedo bombers tried to get down under the screen to attack the ships. Some of the American F-4Fs and F-4Us managed to come down with the bombers, and shot down at least 5 of them by Admiral Turner's count. The torpedo bombers bored in on the invasion fleet, splitting into small attack units so they could approach from different directions at 350. Admiral Turner ordered the ships to begin firing 3 minutes later. He ordered an emergency 90 degrees right turn, several torpedo planes headed for the flagship, the Macaulay, and dropped their torpedoes as they came in the captain of the Macaulay commander. Robert H. Rogers was already in the 90 degrees turn ordered by Admiral Turner, but he made another 90 degrees turn inside that to try to comb the wakes of the torpedoes. He almost made it, but not quite. One torpedo struck the Molia midships just as the gunners were shooting down 2 of the torpedo bombers. The ship began to list to port and went dead in the water, and the reports from the damage control centre indicated that the engine room was flooded with their ship lying helpless. The men of the Macaulay watched in horror as another torpedo headed directly for the disabled flagship, but the torpedo ran just alongside the ship from stern to stem and sank just beyond the bow from their grandstand seat. The men of the Macaulay watched the rest of the attack from the American point of view. It was very satisfying. 17 of the attacking bombers were shot down, and no ships other than the Macaulay were hit. Admiral Turner was taken off the stricken ship by the destroyer Fahrenheit, and Rear Admiral T.S. Wilkinson, his second-in-command, remained aboard the command ship to try to salvage her. 15 men had been killed and 8 wounded by the torpedo explosion, and the wounded were transferred. The Macao was taken in tow by the transport Libra later that day. The tow was transferred to the tug Pawn, which had a difficult time of it, and lost the tow that night while Admiral Turner was considering the problem. Something came out of the night and put 2 torpedoes into the Macaulay. There was no further need to worry about a tow. She went down to join the scores of other ships sunk in these embattled waters. Later, to the chagrin of all concerned, the commander of the local PT boats came into port, boasting of the sinking of an enemy transport in Blanche Channel. That night, Admiral Turner was not known for his patience in such situations. He took immediate personal command of the PT boat operations. The other landings succeeded, although not particularly brilliantly. The Marine raiders, under Lieutenant Colonel Michael S. Currin, who had landed at Siggy Point 10 days earlier, were supposed to move up to Viru Harbour and eliminate the Japanese garrison there, but the planners had not taken proper cognizance of either the weather or the terrain. The mud and the rain and the swollen rivers slowed the troops down in their overland march, and they had to stop and fight off Japanese harassing attacks as well. So when the Viru occupation force arrived at the mouth of that little harbour on June 30th, it was greeted by fire from a naval shore gun and backed off, and its troops were taken back south and put ashore at Sea Point from the Japanese seaplane base in the Shortlands that evening. A group of seaplane bombers took off to attack the Renova anchorage. When they arrived, they found no ships, and so retired that same night of June 30th. Allied bombers attacked the Japanese air bases on New Britain and New Ireland, causing enough damage to put a serious crimp in the next day's operations. In recent days, the bombing of Japanese bases by Admiral Mitch's land-based aircraft and General MacArthur's 5th Air Force had been severe, as had been the losses over the Solomons and New Guinea as of the night of June 30th. The Rabaul force was reduced to a total of 35 Zero Fighters 6 torpedo bombers, 10 twin-engine bombers and 2 scout planes. That night, the 11th Air Fleet called on True for more help, and TR ordered the 21st Air Group down to Rabaul, that would add 60 fighters, 48 torpedo bombers and 16 scout bombers to the force on July 1st. After the 2 companies of the 4th Raiders arrived at Viru, they soon had silenced the shore gun and scattered its operators. Dive bombers from Guadalcanal gave them a hand, and by afternoon the Japanese at Viru were eliminated on July 1st. The Japanese again launched several air attacks from Rabaul to strike at the 2nd section of the American landing force. 35 Zeros and 6 IY torpedo bombers carried out the assault. They went home, claiming to have sunk a destroyer and a cruiser. But the fact was that they did not sink any American ships. They also claimed to have shot down 27 American fighters, with a loss of 5 Japanese fighters and 3 bombers on the mission. The Americans claimed to have destroyed half the Japanese planes. The United States Navy had a more accurate claim for that day's work. That night, the American destroyer Radford discovered the submarine Roe 10101 on the surface and attacked and sank her. On July 2nd, Admiral Kusaka took advantage of the new dictum from Imperial General Headquarters and called on the Army to provide the planes for his mission against the American landings. He sent 24 Army bombers and 30 fighters, most of them Army planes. They kept low on the water all the way down and came in low across the mountains of New Georgia to swoop down on the beach. Head American radar failed to detect them, and the first thing the men on the beachhead knew of the attack, high explosive bombs were falling on them right around the beach. The Americans suffered 150 casualties and serious damage to landing craft and equipment. The Japanese claimed a major victory in the air and on the land and sea. 9 American fighters shot down and 3 probables and no D-Dage to the Japanese Air Force. That night the cruiser Yubari and 6 destroyers moved south through the slot with an air cover and attacked the Renova beachhead. Their intelligence was faulty, however, and near the shore most of the shells fell in the jungle. Beyond, 3 American PT boats were out that night, but they were quarry, not hunters. The destroyer commander herded them into a circle and prepared to gun them down. They saved themselves by making smoke and sneaking out of the circle to save safety, firing 6 torpedoes without effect. Early on the morning of July 2nd at Rabaul, General Imamura sent a helpful suggestion to Admiral Kusaka. Why did the Naval Air Force not launch a massive attack against the shipping in Renova Bay to destroy it in situ, and thus isolate the west side waterway and make it impossible for the transports to move? An ambush was what was wanted. There was just one problem with that suggestion. That was, how was it going to be accomplished? The Japanese Naval Air Force was having a hard enough time just making normal attacks. The Americans obviously had air superiority and naval superiority over the island, and about 3,500 troops ashore. At that time, there still were not enough planes available for the sort of operation the general wanted, despite the cooperation between Army and Navy. The Army was extremely sparing in its allocation of aircraft to meet Admiral Kusaka's requests that morning. At Rabaul, General Imamura paid a call on Admiral Kusaka, and they agreed together that the suggestion was eminently sound, given thorough cooperation, and in their enthusiasm suggested that the chances were 10,000 to 1 that it would succeed if it did not succeed. Then they would have to give serious consideration to new strategy. But the blame inherently would be shared equally at about this same time. Admiral Halsey at Newark was making some command decisions as well. The success of the Rendova landing was complete, while High knew that they had to expect a Japanese reaction in the air, and at sea it had not come yet, and the scout planes flying over Rabaul reported only a handful of Japanese naval vessels in that harbour, so perhaps the Japanese were not going to react for a while once the troops were on the ground. In the Central Solomons command passed from Admiral Turner to Army Major General John H. Hester. Admiral High ordered him now to move against Munda on July 5th. Meanwhile, Marine Colonel Harry Livard had been ordered to move up with 2,600 troops to occupy Rice Anchorage on the northwest shore of New Georgia opposite Kolombangara Island. The purpose of this move was to foreall any attempt by the Japanese to reinforce the Munda area from the Kolombangara base at V. These troops were to move on the night of July 4th. So were the Japanese troops who were coming down to reinforce Munda. Hence, 3 days after the Allied invasion of the Central Solomons, the stage was set for a major confrontation at Siggy Point. Before nightfall, on June 30th, the United States Navy CBEs began working in the rain to build that airstrip. Admiral Holly wanted the airstrip, and he wanted it in a hurry. They had a 2 deadline, so neither bombing nor bad weather stopped their work for long. On June 30th, Rendover Harbour, beneath the 3,400 feet mountain, became a busy advanced base for the PT boats. Lieutenant Commander Robert B. Kelly set up the base, and the troops lived and worked in the rain. On July 1st, it rained all day. The men rose after a night of rain that poured into their pup tents and foxholes to build new foxholes and re-establish their tents. The roads left by the Japanese and the planters of the past had turned into sticky masses of mud, and even these were completely blocked. Most of that first day the artillerymen were moving 155 mm guns into position, and they bogged down time after time. By afternoon, the entire area above the beach was one great mire, and the only way to carry supplies was on human backs through the mud. That was at this point thigh-deep. The men had to labour uphill and down and cross 2 swollen streams to reach higher ground. The men redge foxholes and replaced their pup tents, and that night it rained, and Japanese snipers on the perimeter banged away at them until dawn back at Numa. The quick success of the American landings at Renova persuaded Admiral High that the Japanese were off guard, and he decided to take advantage of this situation by pressing ahead. What he wanted was the quick capture of Munda, which meant he would have the first major Japanese airbase in the Central Solomons, and one that would put Rabaul very definitely within regular attack range. So Holly ordered General Hester to move up the timetable and start the assault on Munda. The general was to do this by ferrying troops over in landing craft from Renova to New Georgia. At Rabaul, Admiral Kusaka and General Imamura were talking about retaking Renova, and that day the Army and Navy staffs were conferring on various plans. Immediately, Japanese Army and Navy units would undertake a cooperative reinforcement to bring more troops down to strengthen the defences of Kolombangara and New Georgia Islands. These troops would be brought by destroyers from Bun and Bua and landed at V. Then those bound for New Georgia would be feared by barge across to Barocco, the port for the Munda airfield. On July 2nd, General Hester undertook the task of moving troops to New Georgia for several days. Army patrols had looked for a suitable landing place near Munda, but they had not found one closer than 5 miles away. That place was Zanana Beach. The real problem was that by landing there, the Army troops would have to make their way through 5 miles of jungle before they could attack 5 miles of jungle, threatened to be hard on field guns and heavy equipment. Just how hard Admiral Holly did not quite realize. The landings at Zanana began on July 2nd and continued as the United States Army infiltrated men, threw in small boats, and in small numbers. It was no way to move any but highly trained raider battalion in the South Pacific. Jungles, meanwhile, Admiral Holly had learned that the Army troops threatened to bog down. He had assembled a force of 2,600 men under Marine Colonel Harry Livard, and they were assigned to move to Rice Anchorage across the strait from V, and there to block off any Japanese attempts to reinforce the Munda area from V, the Kolombangara base. At the same time, Rear Admiral W. Linworth was assigned the task of quieting Villa by a bombardment with the cruisers Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, and 4 destroyers. At approximately the same time, the Japanese at Rabaul had the same idea about Rendover. The plans to retake that important base were in the works. First of all, the American positions had to be worked over. Earlier attempts by the Tokyo Express to attack ships in the harbour had been unlucky every time the Japanese showed up. The American supply missions had either just left Ren over or were at the other end of the line just starting out. So on July 2nd, the Army and the Navy decided to try their first really combined bombing mission. The bombers were Army bombers and the fighters were Navy fighters from Rabu. There weren't too many of the latter, about 24, because the 11th Air Fleet had been ground down to the nub in the recent weeks of fighting. The Army supplied 24 heavy bombers, for once the weather was just about right cloud cover to protect the flyers' entry into the target zone. But clear weather over Renova, the fighters stayed up high and the bomb came in and dropped their bombs on the beach, since they could find no shipping in the harbour, and they caught the United States troops completely by surprise. The Renova garrison, so newly arrived, had only one radar set, and it was down for repair. That day the troops were lined up for the noon meal in the mess area near the beach. The bombers caught them there and caused 125 casualties. They also wrecked the field hospital and knocked out 2 155 mm guns, 4 mm anti-aircraft gun and 2 tractors. 1 or 2 bombs hit the gasoline dump and started a fire that destroyed 100 drums of gasoline. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet got some help at last, and in response to Admiral Kusaka's insistent pleas for reinforcements, Admiral Koga sent down about 50 planes from TR, and on July 3rd, the Rabaul Air Force sent an all-Navy fighter sweep over Renova. They encountered about 40 Allied planes, many of them P-38S, and claimed to have shot down 9 without any damage to the Zeros. The Army was supposed to contribute another group of fighters to this sweep, but they never arrived at the rendezvous. The Army excuse was that the weather was so bad, many of the planes were forced to make emergency landings at various fields, and the others did not find the rendezvous point. The story is probably true. One of the factors in the air war was the enormous difference in caliber of training between Army and Navy. The Army pilots were perhaps expert at low-level troop support, but they had little experience and not much apparent taste for the traditional fighter sweep, and because island defence had originally been assigned to the Navy, the Army bombers had little practice in conducting long-distance flights. On July 4th came the second combined Army-Navy air operation. 17 Army H-97 dive bombers and 49 Navy Zeros set out to attack the American transport fleet at Renova, flying by way of Van Banba and Ljubljana Islands. Most of the Army bombers got lost in the thick cloud cover and did not perform at all. The few that made it all the way soon discovered that the American anti-aircraft fire from land guns and the ships in Rendova harbour was fierce and accurate. The returning planes reported they had sunk 5 transports and set several supply dumps on fire. Actually, they had put bombs between infantry landing craft 23 and tank landing craft 24 and caused so much damage that the 2 ships were bead, but they were not destroyed. The returned Japanese flyers also claimed that their unit had shot down 14 American and New Zealand fighters, but had lost only 6 bombers. The Army's official account of the action credited the 6 as Jibaku self-termination explosions, which could mean that those pilots chose to dive on an objective when their planes were damaged, or could have simply been an honorific way of accounting for the loss. Of the bombers, the concept of the self-termination dive of a distressed plane was always with the Japanese flyers, but at this point in the war the self-termination dive was a matter of personal desperation, not official policy, once again concerning the raid of July 4th. There is enormous disparity between the accounts of the Japanese and those of the Americans. Brigadier General Francis P. Marley, commander of the new Georgia Air Force, which was just setting up shop at Renova, claimed that the United States anti-aircraft guns knocked down 12 twin-engine bombers with the expenditure of only 88 rounds of ammunition. If so, it must have been the most accurate anti-aircraft action of the war. General Marley's statement also seems a bit euphoric in the claim that American fighters shot down 5 Z-2 and only 1 escaped as of July 4th. Then the Japanese and the Americans were of the same mind, reinforced their positions in the Central Solomons INEP preparation for new attacks on the afternoon of July 4th. Colonel Liver's troops were embarked in 7 destroyer transports. They were a combination of men of the 1st Marine Raider Regiment and the Army's 145th and 148th Infantry Regiments. The destroyers moved north toward Kula Gulf, and shortly after midnight on July 5th, they rounded Visu Point on New Georgia and headed into the Gulf. Just then they caught sight of gun flashes. Admiral Ainsworth's bombardment force was in action, after working over V. For a few minutes, the ships turned across the channel to Bairoko Harbor on the New Georgia side. The Japanese usually brought their supplies down to V, and then small craft and barges ferried them over to Barocco for New Georgia's defense. This reinforcement was the task of Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama, and for the task a special reinforcement group had been brought together on July 4th, shortly before sundown. 4 of the destroyers SED-4th from Buin, loaded with troops and ammunition and supplies for Villa at 11:30 Tokyo time. They were in the process of unloading when the flashes of the American bombardment group's guns alerted them, and they hastily put to sea, abandoning the landing. From long distance the destroyers fired spreads of torpedoes at the American shapes, and then turned and scurried away for the safety of the open sea. No destroyer squadron skipper was fool enough to take on a force of cruisers and destroyers, particularly when his decks were loaded with men and supplies. All this while the 7 American destroyer transports were moving up the New Georgia shore toward Rice Anchorage to deposit their troops. Suddenly the time was half an hour after midnight. The destroyer transport Ralph Talbot picked up 2 blips on the radar screen, where no blips ought to be, about 5 mil away to the northwest, moving north at a speed of 25 knots. 2 minutes after the blips appeared, they disappeared from the screen out of range. The ships indicated by the blips were part of Admiral Kusaka's reinforcement team, a fact the Americans discovered 10 minutes later, when the destroyer strong of the bombardment force was hit by a torpedo that seemed to come out of nowhere. The blast opened up the destroyer like a sardine can, flooded the engine rooms and wrecked the forward fire room. The Strong listed to port and skidded to a halt, her back broken, and the destroyed Dyers Charla and Oanon rushed to the rescue of their fellow destroyer. Then the Japanese shore batteries from Boko and Inagi opened up on the destroyers. 1 shell hit the crippled Strong, and the Oanon suspended rescue operations to take on the shore batteries. Other shells from the Japanese guns fell around the transport destroyers, arousing concern lest they be hit. Meanwhile, the men of the Charla were working to take off the crew of the Strong, which was sinking in less than 10 minutes. They brought 241 men across from the stricken ship under fire all the while by the enemy batteries, which were putting shells all around them. The Strong began to settle, and the captain of the Chevalier moved his ship away just in time to avoid entanglement with the sinking ship.